Jax's revenge domain. I stood frozen as Jason Wheeler swept into my workspace, his entourage of executives trailing behind him like obedient ducklings. 28 years old with an MBA still warm from the printer, while I'd spent more than double that time building our client portfolio. In the Navy, we had a term for guys like this, all flash, no substance. But in corporate America, flash sells. My name is Rick Coleman, and until 3 weeks ago, I was the Senior Director of International Growth at a marketing company that had just merged with our biggest competitor. At 49, with 6 years Navy intelligence under my belt and 22 years climbing the corporate ladder, I thought I'd seen every tactical maneuver in the book. I was about to learn that some battles require different rules of engagement. Everyone, I'd like to introduce Rick, who will be handling our legacy accounts, Jason announced, gesturing toward me as if presenting an outdated piece of equipment. From now on, he reports directly to me, legacy accounts. That's what they were calling the relationships I'd spent decades nurturing. In intelligence work, we called this asset devaluation, making your opponent's strengths seem like liabilities. The room went silent. Nobody looked at me. Not Tim Brooks from our European expansion team, the kid I'd mentored for 8 years. Not Amanda Foster from digital marketing. Not even Sarah Mitchell, who'd shared coffee with me every Tuesday for a decade. They studied their shoes, tablet screens, anything but my face. The CEO, William Morrison, stepped forward, his hand on Jason's shoulder like a proud father. We need fresh energy in the international markets. Rick can help you understand our history while you lead us forward. History. There it was again. I was being reclassified from current asset to institutional memory. In military terms, they were putting me out to pasture while the new lieutenant took command of my unit. The corner desk will be yours, Jason told me, pointing to a cramped space. Near the supply closet, I need this office cleared by lunch. My office, the space where I'd closed deals worth 8 figures, where I'd talked desperate clients off ledges during the 2008 crisis, where I'd built something that mattered. The wall still displayed the handwritten thank you letter from Charles Winterman after I'd saved their campaign during Hurricane Florence back in 2018. Understood, I replied, keeping my voice neutral. In the service, you learn not to show emotion when taking incoming fire. Save the reaction for after you've assessed the full scope of the attack. 3 hours later, I watched maintenance workers carry my achievement plaques away in cardboard boxes, while Jason supervised the installation of abstract art pieces on what had been my walls. Each plaque represented a campaign won, a client saved, a problem solved. Now they were being archived like old equipment. The desk goes too, Jason instructed the workers. It's positively ancient. That desk had been a gift from my team after we won Company Achievement of the Year. Solid oak, built to last. Everything that corporate America was moving away from, apparently. My new workspace came equipped with a wobbly chair and a computer that wheezed when booting up. The kind of setup you give someone you're hoping will quit. My phone rang almost immediately. Rick? It was Tim Brooks, my voice tight with discomfort. I'm sorry, but Jason called a team meeting in the Willow Room. When? Right now. He said it's just for team leads. Team leads. I'd been excluded from a meeting about my own department. In intelligence gathering, this is called compartmentalization, isolating your target from their information sources. No problem, I lied, keeping my tone steady. After hanging up, I noticed a new email from Jason to the entire department. Subject line, moving forward, new strategic vision. Attached was a 16-page presentation that made my stomach drop. I opened the file and felt something cold settle in my chest. These weren't just similar ideas to the European expansion strategy I'd proposed 6 months ago. These were my exact proposals, down to the specific market penetration targets for Portugal and Greece. The same strategies our CEO had called too aggressive when I'd presented them. But now they had Jason's name on the cover slide. In the Navy, we had protocols for this kind of intelligence theft. Document everything, verify sources, build an airtight case. Never react emotionally. That's how you lose credibility and give your opponent ammunition. I pulled out my phone and took photos of my screen, then forwarded the original proposal to my personal email from 6 months ago. Timestamps don't lie. A yellow sticky note appeared on my desk at 4:30 p.m. Jason's handwriting. My office, 5 p.m. sharp. I arrived at exactly 5. Punctuality had been drilled into me since boot camp. Jason was leaning against my former desk, typing on his phone with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never had to earn respect through competence. Sit, he said without looking up. I remained standing. Small psychological warfare, but in my experience, whoever controls the physical space often controls the conversation. He finally glanced up, clearly annoyed that I hadn't followed orders. Your European strategy proposal was well received in today's executive meeting. You mean my European strategy? His smile never wavered. Your research was useful groundwork, certainly. But groundwork isn't architecture, Rick. I have modernized and elevated your basic concepts into something actionable. Modernized, elevated. I'd heard this kind of language before, from officers who took credit for enlisted men's innovations. The words were different, but the melody was the same. You copied my work word for word in some sections, I said, keeping my voice level. In intelligence work, you never show your hand too early. Let the target dig their own hole. That's a serious accusation, Jason replied, setting his phone down with deliberate slowness. Especially from someone in your position. My position? He leaned back in my former chair. Another power move I recognized from officer training. People who've been at one company too long often grow territorial, change-resistant. The CEO understands this transition might be difficult for you. Change-resistant. In the Navy, they called guys like me institutional knowledge, the sailors who knew how systems actually worked beyond what was written in the manuals. But in corporate America, institutional knowledge was apparently a liability. Is that why you excluded me from my own team meeting today? Jason sighed theatrically, like a patient teacher dealing with a difficult student. I needed candid feedback about departmental leadership. People aren't always comfortable speaking honestly with their former supervisor present. The implication hit like a tactical strike. He'd been conducting what intelligence officers called human resource exploitation, turning my own team against me by creating artificial divisions and encouraging complaints. We're restructuring the department next month, he continued, his tone shifting to something that might have passed for sympathetic if you didn't know better. Some roles will be eliminated, others will evolve. Your future here depends entirely on your ability to adapt. The threat was crystal clear. In military terms, he was offering me terms of surrender before the real battle began. Is there anything else? I asked quietly. Yes. The Winterman presentation tomorrow. I'll be handling it. Charles Winterman, my client for 16 years. The CEO who'd specifically written into their contract renewal that I would personally oversee their account. The relationship I'd built through 2 recessions, 3 company reorganizations, and countless late-night crisis calls. Charles specifically asked for me to present. I spoke with Charles this morning, Jason said, with the confidence of someone who'd never built a relationship that lasted longer than a quarterly review. He understands the new direction. He was systematically dismantling everything I'd built, my role, my relationships, my reputation, classic psychological warfare, isolate the target, eliminate their support network, then move in for the kill. That's all, he said, attention returning to his phone in a dismissal so casual it felt rehearsed. I walked out, passing the glass-walled conference room where my team still sat in their extended meeting. They fell silent as I passed, eyes darting away like guilty conspirators. Whatever Jason had told them had poisoned the well effectively. Back at my cramped desk, a new email was waiting from HR. Subject line, Performance Development Plan, Confidential. I opened it to find a formal PIP, Performance Improvement Plan. In corporate speak, it was a death sentence with a 90-day countdown timer. The document listed resistance to new leadership and territorial behavior around legacy projects. Reading it felt like reviewing an after-action report written by the enemy. Every interaction I'd had with Jason had been documented, reframed, and weaponized against me. I'd given 22 years to this company, worked through my divorce when Sarah left because I was never home, missed my son Jake's high school graduation to handle the crisis when our biggest European client nearly pulled out in 2019, postponed every vacation, skipped every family gathering that conflicted with the client emergency. Now I was being systematically erased by someone who'd probably never worked a weekend in his life. I shut down my computer, gathered my personal items, and left without saying goodbye to anyone. In the parking garage, I sat in my truck for 20 minutes, watching office workers head home to their families. The rage was there, hot and immediate. But underneath it was something else, something cooler and more familiar. In naval intelligence, we had a saying, emotion is information, not instruction. What I was feeling told me everything about the stakes, but it couldn't guide my response. For that, I needed to think like the analyst I'd been trained to be. That night, I didn't call my ex-wife to complain. I didn't open a beer and drown my sorrows. Instead, I opened my laptop and began what we used to call a comprehensive threat assessment. My external hard drive contained 15 years of digital forensics. Every email, every project file, every presentation I'd ever worked on. I'd started keeping these backups after a server crash nearly lost 3 years of client data back in 2011. In the military, we called it maintaining operational security. In corporate America, it was just good sense. But as I started digging through the archives, I realized I had something more valuable than just my own work history. I had a pattern recognition system trained by military intelligence and refined by 2 decades of corporate strategy. Jason hadn't just stolen my European expansion plan. Looking at the timestamps and file metadata, I could see he'd accessed my proposals within hours of joining the company, which meant someone had given him my login credentials, or he'd found another way into our systems. I opened a secure note-taking application, an old habit from my Navy days, and began documenting everything chronologically. Jason's hiring date, the merger announcement, the timing of his first strategic recommendations to leadership, the dates when my team members had suddenly become unavailable for our regular check-ins. What emerged wasn't random corporate politics. It was a coordinated campaign. By 2 a.m., I had something that made my hands shake. Not from anger this time, but from recognition. I'd seen this pattern before in classified briefings about corporate espionage and industrial sabotage, the kind of operations that made international news when they were finally exposed. Jason Wheeler wasn't just an ambitious MBA trying to climb the ladder by stepping on the old guard. He was something much more dangerous, and I was the only one who could see it. The next morning, I arrived at the office before dawn, old Navy habit that had served me well in corporate life. While Jason and his supporters were probably still sleeping off their victory celebration, I was conducting what intelligence officers call environmental reconnaissance. I needed to understand the full scope of the operation before making my next move. My cramped workstation had one advantage Jason hadn't considered. It was positioned with clear sight lines to both his office and the main conference room. From my corner near the supply closet, I could observe meeting patterns, visitor access, and communication flows without drawing attention. In the military, we learned that intelligence gathering isn't about dramatic infiltration missions. It's about patience, pattern recognition, and paying attention to details that others dismiss as routine. Over the next week, I documented everything. Jason's meetings ran like clockwork. Always the same cast of characters, always behind closed doors, always followed by urgent phone calls he took in private. The pattern reminded me of operational security protocols I'd seen in classified environments. But the real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Tim Brooks appeared at my desk Thursday afternoon, looking uncomfortable and avoiding eye contact. The kid I'd mentored for 8 years who'd gone from eager intern to department supervisor under my guidance. Seeing him squirm felt like watching a son betray his father. "Rick, I need to tell you something," he said, glancing around to make sure we weren't being observed. "About the team meeting last week." I waited. In interrogation training, silence is often the most powerful tool you have. "Jason didn't just ask about your management style," Tim continued, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "He had specific questions about your access to client files, about your backup systems, about whether you keep work documents at home." The pieces clicked together with mechanical precision. Jason hadn't been conducting a typical corporate power grab. He'd been performing what we called a capabilities assessment, mapping my resources, my network, my potential vulnerabilities. "He recorded everything we said," Tim added. "Had his phone on the table the whole time, said it was for accurate documentation of team feedback." "What else did he ask about?" Tim looked miserable. "Your military background, whether you'd ever mentioned specific training or connections, whether you seem to have contacts outside the company, professional intelligence gathering." Jason had been treating me like a target for systematic exploitation, not just a corporate rival to be outmaneuvered. That evening, I made a decision that would have horrified my younger, more trusting self. I was going to investigate Jason Wheeler the same way I'd once investigated foreign assets who might pose a threat to national security. I started with public records, corporate filings, business registrations, LinkedIn connections, university databases, the kind of information that's freely available if you know where to look and how to piece it together. Jason's previous company was called Sterling Analytics, a mid-sized consulting firm specializing in corporate restructuring. According to public filings, they'd declared bankruptcy 8 months ago after a series of high-profile client defections. Nothing unusual there. The consulting business was brutal, and companies failed all the time. But when I dug deeper into the timeline, something didn't add up. Sterling Analytics had been thriving until about 18 months ago. Strong client roster, positive industry coverage, steady growth. Then suddenly, within a 6-month period, they lost 70% of their client base. The business press had attributed it to strategic misalignment and failure to adapt to changing market conditions. I pulled up archived news articles and quarterly reports, building a chronological map of Sterling's decline. What I found made my chest tighten with recognition. The same pattern I was seeing at our company had played out at Sterling Analytics, almost beat for beat. Promising young executive joins the firm. Traditional leadership gets marginalized. Aggressive new strategies get implemented over veteran objections. Client relationships get modernized by the newcomer, and then systematic collapse. I cross-referenced Jason's employment dates with Sterling's client loss timeline. He'd joined Sterling 22 months ago as Director of Strategic Innovation. The client defections had started exactly 4 months later. But here's what made my training officer instincts start screaming. After Sterling collapsed, their client list had been acquired by an investment consortium called Apex Holdings for what the bankruptcy filings described as nominal consideration. I ran Apex Holdings through every corporate database I could access. Shell company registered in Delaware, with ownership traces that led through a maze of subsidiary corporations and offshore entities, the kind of structure you built when you wanted to hide who was really pulling the strings. It took 3 days of careful research, but I finally found the connection that made everything clear. Apex Holdings was ultimately controlled by Hartwell and Associates, our biggest competitor, the same company we'd supposedly merged with 2 months ago. Jason Wheeler hadn't been hired to improve our international growth. He'd been planted to destroy it from within, then transfer our client relationships to Hartwell through the same bankruptcy and acquisition pattern he'd executed at Sterling Analytics. Corporate espionage, industrial sabotage, the kind of operation that federal prosecutors love to make examples of. I had evidence of pattern and method, but I needed proof of intent, something concrete that would stand up in both corporate boardrooms and federal courtrooms. That's when I remembered something Tim had mentioned in passing. Jason kept detailed files in his office, locked in what he called his strategic planning cabinet. He'd made a joke about it during one team meeting, saying old-school security was sometimes better than digital files. In Navy intelligence, we had protocols for acquiring evidence from secure locations. I wasn't planning anything illegal. I just needed to confirm what I already suspected. Friday evening, after Jason left for what I'd observed was his regular happy hour routine, I made my move. The strategic planning cabinet wasn't actually that secure. Standard office furniture lock, the kind you could open with basic tools if you knew what you were doing. And I definitely knew what I was doing. Inside, I found exactly what I expected to find, and worse than I'd imagined. Detailed dossiers on every key employee in our international division. Financial analysis of our client relationships, with specific strategies for transitioning each account to Hartwell's portfolio. Timeline documents showing the planned sequence of our company's dismantling. And at the bottom of the stack, a folder labeled Coleman, Richard, Neutralization Strategy. My hands were steady as I photographed every document with my phone. 22 years of corporate experience, 6 years of military training, and I'd never felt more focused in my life. They'd made one critical error. They'd underestimated who they were dealing with. Monday morning, I walked into the office carrying a manila folder and the calm confidence of someone who'd spent the weekend preparing for war. Jason's neutralization strategy had been thorough, but it contained one fatal flaw. He documented everything. In intelligence work, we had a rule: never write down what you can't afford to have read in court. I placed the folder on Jason's desk at 7 a.m., an hour before he typically arrived. A simple note attached: for your review, strategic planning analysis. Then I positioned myself at my corner workstation and waited. Jason arrived at his usual time, coffee in hand, phone already pressed to his ear. I watched him notice the folder, frown, and end his call abruptly. He opened it cautiously, like a bomb disposal expert approaching an unknown device. The reaction was everything I'd hoped for. His face went through a spectrum of emotions: confusion, recognition, panic. He grabbed his phone and made 3 rapid calls, his voice too low for me to hear, but his body language screaming crisis management. Within 20 minutes, CEO William Morrison was striding toward Jason's office, flanked by our head of security and someone I didn't recognize but who had corporate lawyer written all over his expensive suit. The meeting lasted 2 hours. Through the glass walls, I could see Jason gesticulating, pointing in my direction, pulling up files on his laptop. Morrison's expression grew darker by the minute. At 11:30, security escorted Jason out of the building. He didn't even get to clean out his desk. My phone rang immediately. Morrison's assistant, Mr. Coleman, please report to the executive conference room. I found Morrison waiting with Catherine Weber from the board of directors, Michelle Thompson from legal, and the stranger from Jason's office, who introduced himself as Federal Agent David Harris from the FBI's Economic Crime Unit. Sit down, Rick, Morrison said, his voice carefully neutral. We need to discuss the materials you provided this morning. I took the seat directly across from Morrison, hands folded calmly on the table. After 6 years of military debriefings and 22 years of corporate meetings, I knew when to speak and when to wait. Agent Harris leaned forward. Mr. Coleman, how did you obtain these documents? They were left unsecured in an unlocked office, I replied truthfully. I photographed them for documentation purposes when I observed a potential security breach. Catherine Weber studied me with new interest. You're claiming Mr. Wheeler was conducting industrial espionage? I'm showing you documented evidence of systematic corporate sabotage, I corrected. The patterns match similar operations at his previous company, Sterling Analytics, which coincidentally was acquired by the same investment group that now holds significant shares in our firm. Agent Harris nodded. We've been tracking this particular network for 18 months. Your evidence fills in several gaps in our investigation. Morrison looked physically ill. How extensive is the damage? I opened my laptop. Jason accessed 847 confidential files during his time here. He copied strategic plans worth approximately $15 million in projected revenue. He systematically undermined 7 key client relationships, with 4 already showing signs of defection to Hartwell and Associates. But the good news, I continued, is that I identified the pattern early enough to prevent most of the intended damage. Charles Winterman's contract, for instance, contains specific language that would void their agreement if their assigned account manager is changed without written consent. Jason never bothered to read that clause. Catherine Weber was taking rapid notes. What's your recommendation for damage control? Full transparency with affected clients, immediate security audit of all systems Jason accessed, and implementation of the operational security protocols I outlined in my original strategic plan, the one Jason tried to steal. Morrison finally spoke up. Rick, I owe you an apology. Several apologies, actually. What I want, I said, isn't an apology. It's a commitment that this company will value institutional knowledge alongside innovation. That experience will be treated as an asset, not a liability. Agent Harris closed his notebook. Mr. Coleman, we'll need your full cooperation as this investigation proceeds. Mr. Wheeler and his associates are facing federal charges for corporate espionage, wire fraud, and conspiracy. Of course, I replied. Whatever you need. After the FBI agent left, Morrison turned to Catherine Weber. I want Rick heading up our new corporate security division. Full authority to implement counterintelligence protocols across all subsidiaries. Catherine nodded. Agreed. And Rick, we're also promoting you to Regional Director of Strategic Operations. Your first assignment is auditing our other recent hires for similar patterns. That afternoon, Charles Winterman called personally. Rick, I just heard what happened. Son, in 16 years of working together, I've never been more impressed. How did you see it coming? I looked out my window, my original office, now restored to me, at the city skyline. Charles, in the Navy, they taught us that the best defense is knowing your enemy better than they know themselves. Jason made the mistake of thinking corporate espionage was just business. But this was personal. He attacked my team, my relationships, my reputation. That made it warfare. And you won. We all won. The company's secure, the clients are safe, and next quarter we're implementing the European expansion strategy I originally proposed, under my leadership. 6 months later, the Jason Wheeler network trials made national news. Federal prosecutors called it one of the most sophisticated corporate espionage operations they'd ever uncovered, spanning 12 companies across 4 states. Jason received 8 years in federal prison. Our company not only survived, but thrived. The European expansion exceeded projections by 23%. Charles Winterman renewed their contract for another 5 years, specifically requesting that I personally oversee their account until one of us retires. Tim Brooks, who'd found the courage to come forward with Jason's questioning, became my deputy in the corporate security division. Sometimes the best mentoring happens when your student learns to do the right thing under pressure. The real victory wasn't destroying Jason Wheeler. It was proving that in corporate America, just like in military service, there's no substitute for competence, loyalty, and the patience to let your enemy defeat themselves. Some battles are won with flash and aggression. The important ones are won with preparation, intelligence, and the wisdom that comes from understanding that every war is ultimately about protecting what matters most. I'm still here. They're not. And every day, I use what I learned to protect others from making the same mistake our company almost made. That's not revenge. That's responsibility. And it's exactly where a 49-year-old Navy veteran belongs. Experience isn't just about surviving corporate battles. It's about knowing which fights are worth having and which enemies will destroy themselves if you give them enough rope. The most dangerous weapon in any workplace isn't politics or connections. It's a patient man who pays attention, takes notes, and never forgets that competence always wins in the long game.